Welcome back. Many thanks to Logan for an excellent panel session just now. And it's a good segue into our second panel of the day, which focuses on competition reform. I'm delighted this panel will also be moderated by one of the IIC's associate members, Gordon Moyer, partner, Wigan LLP. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think, like many of you, I wish I was in DC. This is one of my favorite events of the year, and it's always a great success. So thank you for the opportunity to chair. The topic of this panel is competition dynamic in digital markets. Is reform needed? Well, frankly, I think all of us have seen the amount of effort that's being put into this area at present and over the last year has been immense. And I think we are going to have a fabulous discussion today about what is happening. My firm is a law firm based in London and Brussels. We specialize in regulation and competition in digital markets, including sectoral regulation. So this is an area in which we are passionately involved. But more importantly, we've got a great panel today to take us through and unpick some of the key issues in this space. We're going to try and cover off as much as we possibly can, including the picture in multiple jurisdictions and what different states are doing in this area. We're going to try and look at some best practice to this extent we're seeing that, and potentially some worst practice also, and then try and just develop on some of the remedies that are being picked up. So we've got a lot to cover. The format of the session is that we have 6 panelists. I'll introduce each of them in turn. They will then spend 5 to 10 minutes with their opening remarks on their perspectives on this topic. Then we will open up to themed questions and to questions from the audience. So please do have those to hand. So that is where we're up to. Looking forward to the next 90 minutes with you all. So we're very lucky to have with us now our first panel member, Danielle Coffey. She's the SVP and General Counsel at the News Media Alliance. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great, thank you. I'm also going to share screen because I have a presentation, although it's only a 5-minute introduction. So I'm not sure if I really need it, but sometimes people like visuals. So I will absolutely share my presentation. The news media, I'm with the News Media Alliance. I run our policy and advocacy and legal efforts here to represent the news publishers, domestic and international. We represent newspapers. We used to be Newspaper Association of America for about 100 years, but because we've become so digital, we changed our name and we changed the way our members look. Our news publishers are doing tremendous because we're talking about the transition of a lot of our industries have had to adapt to the internet. And in many ways, in most ways, we've seen exponential growth of our audience because of the readership that we have, the digital readership we have, which is now how most of our content is consumed. So our audience is through the roof, so to speak, but our revenue has declined rapidly over the same period of time. Our traffic comes from 2 major platforms, Google and Facebook, and our revenue from that traffic is obviously insignificant in comparison. And the reason why is because the distribution is controlled by these 2 platforms. And we really looked into why, because we have so much audience and during these periods of time, especially during the pandemic globally, which is why you've seen a lot of global activity around the world regulating this space, is because during the pandemic, our audience was, it was already accelerated before, and then it just did this huge spike. And there's been studies looking at what happened there. It's mostly because the news, the geographic area that everybody was interested in became so narrow and local that news publications that cover local and small communities We're covering what was happening in those communities, such as school closing, business openings, the health, just health information, vaccination, so on and so forth, that the many of our news publishers actually took down their paywalls because it was access to vital information. And so, but what happened that Australia and Europe saw was during that same period of time, the revenues went down, which is an anomaly. And what that was it was a magnification of a current problem that we already knew existed. The first problem that we have with the distribution partners, who is primarily where consumers and our readers get their information from, it's our content, they just get it through these distribution channels. And it's a walled garden. So there's news and information that's in, you know, at the top, it's a carousel called AMP, which I'll go into in a second. And then underneath that, it's featured snippets, and it answers your question. It includes a paragraph that's taken from our articles. And then it has some other things you might also ask, and it has drop downs. And then it has a list of advertising, so you can pay to be in the first section of search. And then way down, you find organic search content, which is our articles, which is why only 65% of people click through, because it's a walled garden where the platforms want you to stay within the walled garden, because the more engagement within that garden and the more consumer activity, the more data, which is their currency, they can get from that user. So that's the evidence. That's what we found when studying this anomaly of why is it that the revenue isn't coming in. And then the example of that, you know, I think is probably most troublesome is AMP, the accelerated mobile pages, where our members, our publishers are forced to format and hand over their articles if they want to be found at the top. And it's a carousel, and it has a lightning bolt, and it's hosted by Google. So we don't get as much ad revenue or data from our reader. We actually don't even know if they're a subscriber in many cases. We have we've had troubles metering. We don't have as much churn. Our members did a survey of how much in comparison they got from subscriptions from AMP articles versus organic search articles, and it was weighted heavily in favor of search articles. So AMP is not it's not if we had our choice, which obviously we don't have our choice. That's why this is an anti-competitive situation. If we had our choice, we would not choose AMP, obviously, because it has harmful consequences. But it's a Hobson's choice, what we call it. It's like asking someone if they want air. You want to be present, you want to be found. And so we have to comply with AMP. AMP also, on top of that, has onerous terms of service, meaning if you are found in AMP, which obviously, you know, you would opt to be, Google can use your content however it would like. They can use your content in any fashion they would like on any of their products and any of their services. So it comes with these additional requirements on top of just the flawed product. So that's just an example that I use because AMP has become the entryway into many of these other products and services that we then are also harmful to our news publications' ability to get revenue. I'll just move on real quick because there's two elements to the harm that's caused. The first is the distribution that I just went over as far as how our content is distributed. And that is, there are pending cases throughout the country addressing the preferencing and the search manipulation, and that's following Europe's claims against Google as well, which were successful, and we've seen globally. So this is the global and also the US legal findings. I'm just giving the sliver of how those abusive behaviors, those anti-competitive behaviors, have impacted the news industry, because that is who I represent. Another example of, you know, at a macro level, we know that Google and Facebook are anti-competitive in the advertising ecosystem. We're all aware of the DOJ, the cases that are pending, the results in Europe, Australia, around the world, around the anti-competitive conduct in the advertising ecosystem. And we all saw the complaints that revealed and unredacted the evidence that this is intentional anti-competitive behavior on the buy side and the sell side to both dominate and extract terms and fees that even Google in there was quoted as saying, I'm not sure how we've gotten away with this for so long, because it's 19,000 times of the fee that an exchange would charge, like the New York Stock Exchange. So there's a lot of interest there. It's why there's pending litigation to hold them accountable for that behavior. And it obviously, again, and it's because of a series of acquisitions over a period of time that went unregulated, and it's now being reversed by regulation and litigation around the world. And then holding them accountable. And then the last thing that I would just say is that news, quality journalism and quality content is too important to society and too important to what we need in our communities around our country and around the world to wait for a solution. And there are still many who will argue, despite the evidence, that there's no problem. But even those who, which most will now acknowledge that there's a problem, when we're talking about solutions, these solutions are long-term in nature, and news, the journalism can't be impacted for much longer without going away. And so we have a bill that's pending in Congress, much like Australia and Europe, now Canada and Latin America, to have news content compensated, much like music, television, film, other content industries are compensated for various reasons that I won't go into, because this isn't a copyright panel. We have gone without that, but our legislation that's pending, the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, addresses this urgent need to address the competition problem with the platforms that would then require compensation for news publications. And I'm really looking forward to discussing that on this panel with some of you who I know well, and I look forward to having this discussion, and I thank you for asking me to join.
Thank you, Danielle. That was great, and really useful to have those real life examples up front as well, because I think it really sets the scene for the rest of the discussion. And I'm sure there were so many themes there you picked up from the acquisition cycle that we've seen, the gatekeeper role, and some of the international approaches as well. We're seeing in different jurisdictions. I think we'll have some great conversations about that later. So thank you so much. Next up, we're very fortunate to have Maureen Olhausen, who's a partner and the section chair at Baker Botts LLP, specializing in antitrust and competition law. So Maureen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be on this panel. So I want to give a little perspective about, at least in the US, and I think often globally, this was the view of what antitrust law should be doing and how it operates. Which was really focused on what are the ultimate impacts on consumers, whether it is an individual consumer, a regular person on the street, or a buyer of a particular service, and would certain behaviors by firms or proposed mergers make those consumers better off or worse off. The focus was not on protecting competitors. That's a real sort of slogan to antitrust law, at least in the US and globally, at least for a while, to say competition law, antitrust law is about consumers. It's not about individual competitor models. And sometimes you do see big changes in markets that have impacts on certain players that may be something that really changes the landscape for them. But there's been this kind of growing, I think, chorus about the idea that perhaps antitrust law needs to be doing something else, be doing something different, be focused on the interests of some other players. And some of this grew out of research suggesting, though the research is subject to some severe questioning about growing concentration in U.S. industry, the economy writ large, not in particular areas, but broader. And the idea that with increasing concentration, there have been negative follow-on effects. I think that one of the other things that we've seen, and it has grown out of some of the concerns that Danielle identified, is the idea that so in the U.S. we don't have, at least hasn't been recognized at the Supreme Court level, and it really doesn't have much purchase in the courts, the idea that an essential facilities doctrine. When you think about the idea that a competitor has a valuable asset platform, it could be a bridge over the river, it could be a ski slope in Colorado, or a platform. Under what terms are they obligated to share that with other competitors, right? And when in antitrust law would you have to do that? And it's a very, very strict standard in the US, not recognized the idea that there's this sort of general obligation to share with competitors because the competitor, needs it, wants it, would like to have access to it. So that's kind of the general approach that's been reflected in the US consumer welfare standard, and looking at mergers on whether they would create efficiencies or whether they're competitively neutral, and only if they were going to create anti-competitive outcomes for consumers were mergers prohibited or challenged. But today we are seeing proposals both in Congress and some discussion, I think, at the FTC, and unclear whether the DOJ will also pick up this mantra about whether antitrust should be doing something different. Some of the bills that are being considered would require platforms to grant access to competitors, either and I should say, for both access to data and interoperability with their systems. And then there are some bills that would also put restrictions on the ability of some of these companies to merge, with the idea that they would flip the burden, where up till now in the US, if you're the government has to carry the burden of proof if it's challenging your behavior, that would flip the burden for some of these larger companies to prove that an acquisition is pro-competitive. And some discussions have even included just outright bans. So this would be really a very big change in US antitrust law. I do think some of the issues about access to data and customer data, things like that, are interesting, because they put, I think, a little bit of tension between some of the other concerns that are being raised, which is about free access to consumer data. I mean, freely available, I don't mean non-monetary, but freely available access to consumer data, and the collection and use and sharing in particular of customer data. And so some of these bills are considering having essentially a right of access to at least some of the data, and then the company would have to show that it was limiting it for these privacy and protective reasons, and if they didn't get it right, they would be subject to a big fine. So that creates an interesting tension. And one of the other things that we're seeing is that while some of the legislation in Congress seems to be targeted at a handful of large US platform companies, the rhetoric at the FTC about unfair methods of competition and rulemaking, and their overall discouragement of mergers kind of across the board by creating extended delays and greater uncertainty and looking at non-competition factors. These changes may not be limited in the way people expect, who's pushing the legislation to, for big platform companies. It seems like the FTC may try to take these concepts and promulgate them more broadly throughout the economy. And I think that's something that really needs careful consideration, because that may not, be addressing some of the kinds of concerns, that Danielle has raised, and actually may create, I think, some, worrisome dynamics in antitrust enforcement in the US. Less ability to review, less predictability, greater uncertainty, more entanglement between competitors, and limitations or tension with privacy kinds of concerns that about customer data and user data. So I'll stop there. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Maureen. That was really, really, really great stuff. And we'll have a lot of questions, I suspect, around particularly that dynamic of competition law moving into more regulatory modes and almost an ex-ante model. And certainly we'll have some of the later speakers will talk about some of the European dynamics there as well, which, as you know, are very different. So thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. So now we're very fortunate to move on to our next speaker, is Nivea Sundar, who is the Executive Director of the Caricom Competition Commission. So we're very pleased to have you, and over to you.
I'm so glad that the IIC is having this forum. I think it's very pertinent at this point in time. Just by way of a very short background, the Caribbean Community Single Market and Economy was established by the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in 2001. And just in case you hear single market, because it did establish a single market and economy and you think it's like the EU, I'd like to dissuade you of that idea. Really and truly what it is, it's a forum for regional integration imperatives to be agreed by independent and sovereign, albeit very, very small nation states, some of which have a surface area of less than 1,000 square kilometers. Now, we've got about 15 members in the CSME, and under Chapter 8 of the RTC, the Caricom Competition Commission, of which I'm the head, was established. Now, generally, we have a very big imbalance between what happens in the Caricom and what is happening in the rest of the world when it comes to competition regulation and communications regulation as a whole. So generally, enforcement of competition control is challenged in the CSME by the following. I would call them the principles deficiency, because in the EU, we've got direct effect and direct applicability. In the Caricom, we don't have that. There's absolutely no body of community competition law, even though we refer to that in our treaty. It's really just an idea of harmonized principles that we all adhere to. So member states just come together and agree principles, and then they are required to incorporate these principles in whatever form they see best into their legislation. So there's no stick over the head as there may be in the EU. There's also a compliance deficiency, because since 2001, member states were required to enforce and to put in place legislation that would set up a competition framework in their countries. Out of the 15, since 2001, we've got 4 member states with working legislation, and 2 of those member states don't have major control. And also, it's really good to note that the Competition Commission for the Caricom, we are responsible for cross-border matters. We also don't have major control policy agreed yet by member states. So we really just have anti-competitive agreements and cartels, anti-competitive conducts that don't fall within M&A. And if there is an M&A happening in the Caricom, we issue our concerns to the member states involved. But basically, that is our mandate. So we therefore have the third problem of limited powers. We can't act on our own volition unless it's through national legislation. So we need each member country to have a competition act or sector regulation act that says that the sector regulator with competition powers can liaise with us in order to do anything of a competition nature in a country. And the core components, which is the next challenge, the core components that are required for a working communications framework, it's missing in the Caricom. And I'm going to just address it very quickly in 4 points. We don't have communications legislation of a very wide brush. It focuses in the Caricom on authorizations and spectrum, for the most part, numbers, and there's very little focus on standards for service providers and consumer rights. And when I say little focus, the regulators want it, but the regulations and the legislation is not in place for these aspects. Secondly, we have privacy and data protection legislation, which broadly contains concepts of the general privacy principles. But we don't even come anywhere near close to GDPR when it comes to the consumer right of information, for example, on algorithms and how they influence consumer choice, how data can be mined, stored, and etc. Particularly given the way that the Caribbean has a high usage of internet, data protection and consumer rights are pretty critical because that's the major imbalance we have with the digital economy at this point. Third, we don't have a legislative framework in the Caribbean and member states that's fully rolled out for e-commerce, e-payments, e-signatures. And lastly, we don't have a cybersecurity or cyber health framework that's really working and functional in the Caribbean. So public key infrastructure aspects are missing. Now, the delay in rolling out all of these elements means that if in the event we have Caricom legislation and member state legislation in any of these things, it's very possible that the legislation is already passé because of the development rate in the rest of the world with the technologies. So we are already suffering a very, very bad imbalance in the Caribbean. And this lack of foundational elements and these key tools makes us vulnerable to exploitative conducts by the big players at the expense of not just the business players, but also the consumers. Now, most, if not all, major digital platforms operate in the Caribbean, but they are not required to be authorized in the Caribbean. So therefore, they can skate around, above, below any existing regulatory framework very easily. And there's very little redress for consumers from a welfare perspective, except for what's provided by the platform itself. So position all of this against what's happening in the rest of the world, where if you had a chance to read the UNCTAD's 2021 Digital Economy Report, the tech superpowers of the USA and China have the lion's share of the global market right now. There's 50% of the high-scale data centers residing in USA and China. They've got the highest rate of 5G adoption, 94% of funding for AI startups, and 90% of market capitalization. So it's not really good when you compare what's happening in Caricom and what's happening to the rest of the world. I really do like what the Secretary General for UNCTAD said, that the current fragmented data landscape risks us failing to capture value that could accrue from digital technologies, and it may create more space for substantial harms related to privacy breaches, cyber attacks, and other risks. Now, the report itself calls for a holistic global policy approach, reflecting the multiple and interlinked dimensions of data, balancing different interests and needs in a way that supports inclusive and sustainable development with the full involvement of countries trailing behind in digital readiness. Please read this report, folks. Now, I agree with the position from a theoretical point of view, and all of this is very pretty, but quite frankly, if one, there's no element of compulsion required by the wider international community on the part of the small nations, and two, if they don't provide the full funding for the small nations to meet the requirements of the compulsion, then small nations will continue to avoid full implementation of these components and politically prioritize around them. The best thing, quite sadly, was the COVID pandemic, as the need for online all the time became an immediate reality, not just for the suburbs, but the rural kids too. And whereas band-aids of mobile data and Wi-Fi hotspots temporarily cured the problem, the fact remains that small nations are not prepared financially or politically to prepare the key infrastructure required for fixed permanent broadband and e-commerce, nor the components for a fair and efficient marketplace in the digital economies. So, recommendations for reform, Gordon. Some degree of grandfathering is still required, even though we've been at regional integration now for over 20 years in the Caricom. We do require that grandfathering by the global community of the small nations, and the quick reform to get on board for the small nations: compel, coming from outside, fund, please protect the global consumer, because if you are protecting the global consumer, then the consumer in the Caricom will be protected. If you have that right for anonymization and information requirements on the data being culled and what is being done with that data, I think it's very critical. So basically, my major reform when it comes to small nations and small developing economies: reform without to benefit those within. Because right now it's really an issue of funding and political will. So all the fancy policies in the world won't help us unless there's that element of compulsion, funding, protection. Those are my key 3 steps, Gordon. That's what I have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a great way to kick us off again. And I love the notion around the global consumer. And I think that's one huge theme. Obviously, in small nations, it's a big issue around resource, but also in terms of the supranational rules. But how does the law work, even between the US and the EU and other jurisdictions, but also smaller countries? So thank you so much for that. That's really appreciated. And we look forward to keeping that discussion going after the rest of our speakers. So on that note, we're very privileged to have with us Dr. Tobias Schmidt, who's the chair of the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Services, and also the director of the Media Authority for North Rhine-Westphalia. So Dr. Schmidt, over to you.
Thanks to you, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to participate, and of course the honor. Thanks for the very polite introduction. Indeed, my core job is being head of or director of the Media Authority of North Rhine-Westphalia. I'm sure no one of you is aware of this. This is one of the German states, and we have about 20 million inhabitants here in North Rhine-Westphalia. We have a federal structure. That's interesting because if you are used to handle a federal structure, you're not so much in fear about the fact that we at the moment realize a global challenge, but sitting on different nations, different legal frameworks, because this is something that is more or less our daily business. And it is also in Europe, as you know, and at the moment, I'm also the representative of the German media authorities in the European Commission, and in this function chairing indeed ERGA, and ERGA is the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media and Advisory Board of the European Commission. So this is just in a nutshell. Of course, if you're interested in the interesting European structures, then take another 2 hours and a coffee break. But up from this, I would like to try to match the point of this panel. Not that easy, also for you, I think, Gordon, and moderation, because we have an extreme broad approach to this. So why I'm here, I do not know exactly, but I think there are 2 aspects I can deliver to this discussion. The first is the perspective of a media regulator, because as this is my function, and media regulation is a little bit, how to say, slightly different from the classical telecommunication or competition regulation. It could be interesting. It doesn't make it easier, but it's another aspect. And the second aspect could be the European perspective as a European media regulator. So I try to bring these 2 aspects in. First of all, and here I agree to the speakers before, I think we have a common ground when we say, there is, because of the digitization, a situation where industry that we are confronted with, or as partner of us, however, normally has now more than one legal character in their offers. You know, this is in most areas a change. In the past, we have had contact to telecommunication industry or media industry, or I don't know what. So, and now we have with companies like, for example, Amazon or YouTube and so on, companies, they have more than one character. And that's why it's how to say, it's an additional challenge for regulation to say, okay, and how to combine these different aspects. Is there one aspect dominant, or do we have to find how they work together? The second aspect, I think we can agree, is that globalization leads, as we've heard 5 minutes ago, leads to a situation where we have permanent issues of the question, okay, and who's responsible? Which kind of jurisdiction is the relevant? Is it, and this is in between big and smaller members, as you said, Gordon, and I totally agree, it's a question also between Europe and the US. It's internally of Europe, and a strong question because we have this idea of country of origin principle and so on. So we have different systems, country of destination, country of origin. We have the question if there is at the end a real chance to find one common answer, or do we have to learn how to handle different answers in this structure? So this leads to the first outcome for this panel, and to the question of this panel: is there a need of reform? Yes, for sure. It is like it is, and I think no one would have another opinion. But I think it is not only a question of competition, and here I agree to the aspects of Maureen or also Danielle, that we have other aspects here coming together, and that makes it much more, how to say, inspiring, interesting, challenging, and we've got to find answers here. And the second question, of course, is, okay, and who should do this reform? Who's the responsible body for that? So if I am allowed, then I would like to have a short spotlight on these two questions. The first is, why not only competition? I think that's almost clear, especially like Danielle said, because, you know, there is a big difference between the ideas of competition law and, for example, media law. And the very easiest reason for that is we have two different objectives. Competition law protects market and consumers. Media law protects democracy and citizens and pluralism. So that's why we have very often a situation where the objectives of media law are quite the opposite of competition law. So for example, as Danielle described, the question, could there be public money to support journalism, is something that is in the normal logic of competition law, or something that is normally a no-go. So to generate pluralism in the democratic sense could be something where we need the opposite or the other to go the other way around. And in another very important aspect, the media law knows very often the tool of being active upfront. So it's very often an ex ante regulation. Competition normally is, as far as I understood, I'm not very familiar with that, but it's normally the other way around. It's normally an ex post regulation. So why is it so? Very simple, because in media we say if the risk has realized itself, then it's too late. So that's why you've got to be careful upfront, but this is not easy because at the same time we are talking about freedom of expression and speech. So that's why I think we have more than one regulatory approach, because we have more than one political objective. And that is at the end the core reason why we have this very intensive discussion in Europe about the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, because here we try to find an one-fits-it-all regulation, a holistic approach, in general a good idea, and this all over Europe. I totally support this, also in the name of ERGA. But of course, it leads to the very difficult question how to respect on this way also the facts that we have internally in this idea different objectives. And media, as I said, is sometimes the opposite from, for example, competition. So that's why just to the DSA and DMA, we, the European regulators, are absolutely supporting the idea of the European Commission of the Digital Services Act. And at the same time, we say we've got to take care that the operative business of regulation nevertheless is not damaged by that, because this is mainly something, and here I could come back to the point of Trinidad, where we have got to find solutions country by country. You know, you have got to make a kind of daily business, and an abstract rule is not very helpful for that. So last point, I think, and this is at the end very interesting, and that's why I'm so grateful to participate here. You know, at the end we came to the question, okay, and who should change the policy? And this is a real problem, because we are talking about the same terms, but I'm not sure if we mean the same things. You know, this is, let's start the most simplest way. It's between the US and Europe. Yes, like we always use this narrative about the Western democracies. Yes, I totally agree. But if you take the structure of regulation, then you have an historical difference of culture. The core idea of US regulation is normally protecting freedom. And the key element for that is competition law, because you say as long as the market works, everything is fine. And if not, then we've got to intervene on that way, as far as I understand. The European aspect, especially the Central European aspect, is the other way around, because the core idea of the states in the center of Europe is the idea of, how to say, a political welfare state. So we are setting up a lot of political objectives, pluralism, democracy, and so on. So that's why we have a very, how to say, it's this idea of constitutional freedom has not the same dimension of freedom, because then we have other dimensions. So it is another idea of protecting freedom by setting more rules. So I know you know all the sentence of Winston Churchill because he's more on the US side, because the British system is a little bit more similar to the US system. And I think Winston Churchill said, as a citizen of Great Britain, you can live your whole life without getting in contact with the state only if you go to the post office. That's it. And this is a way that you do not have in the central states of Europe. And that's something I don't will say that's better or worse. It is like it is. And we've got to find a solution in between this. And then let's take the other parts of the world, especially in the online world, in a lot of senses, much more important in Europe. And I think here we have areas where we have a situation that is much closer to our ideas or very far away, like we know from one very big market in the East. So for me, for the European regulators, it is very clear, and this is one additional outcome. We have to have this reform because we can't just leave it to the industry as far as we are talking about democracy. That's why we are supporting these ideas of the DSA, Digital Services Act, or DMA, Digital Market Act. I think there will come a new impulse from Europe, and I think that's a good thing. So we have something where we can work with and can see if it works. But nevertheless, I'm sure there are still answers needed for the first question, how to act in between the different regulatory areas, and second, how to act in between cultures and state systems on this. And that's why I think the topic of this discussion today couldn't be more actual and relevant than it is. Thanks a lot that I have the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much for that. That was an incredibly useful. And thank you also for explaining the sort of sheer philosophical differences, I think, that we see across the globe at the moment in terms of approaches to regulation and when regulation is needed. And I think your analogies are absolutely right. I think Winston Churchill possibly wouldn't recognize the UK at the moment in terms of those rules. And it's fascinating with the new digital regulation in the UK, how aligned, and we won't mention Brexit, but how aligned the regulatory models in the UK are actually with where Europe is proposing to go. And the only difference really, to be honest, apart from one or two, is on timing. So it's a really interesting period. And I think we've got so much to cover. As you said, we've got the small questions of why and how, really. You know, why are we reforming? What are the objectives? And how do we get there? So thank you so much for your insights. That's super appreciated. And look forward to keeping on the discussion in the open session after the next two speakers. So thank you, Dr. Schmidt. So without further ado, we now have, and we're very fortunate to have, Commissioner Ramiro Camacho Castillo. He's the Commissioner at the Federal Telecoms Institute in Mexico. So Ramiro, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello to everyone, and thank you for having me here today in this IIC forum. First, I would like to let you know that the Federal Telecommunications Institute is the authority for both ex-ante regulation and competition law enforcement in Mexico, both in the telecommunication and broadcasting sectors. One of our main commitments is the promotion of effective competition in the provision of regulated services. This promotion can be carried out through IFT powers as an ex-ante regulator or as a competition authority. In this respect, the Mexican competition law grants the IFT powers to remove barriers to competition, the divestiture of assets, and the regulation of essential facilities in those markets where ineffective competition conditions are still found after an investigation. As a competition authority, and with the aim of facilitating the deployment of infrastructure for better connectivity, we have an investigative authority which is partially or quite independent from the board of the IFT that carries out investigations. That they have carried out 2 investigations in the last couple of years, in which they determined the existence of ineffective competition conditions caused by regulatory barriers in the deployment and provision of fixed broadband services in 2 Mexican states. As part of this investigation, they they included, or we at the Institute approved also measures to different public authorities of each of the 2 Mexican states for the removal of normative and administrative restrictions. The IFT Board of Commissioners had endorsed the conclusion of this investigative authority, finding that the identified regulatory barriers restricted the entry and expansion of fixed broadband providers in many municipalities by limiting the deployment of telecommunications infrastructure, particularly by increasing transactions costs due to the unclear and irregular procedures and requirements for authorization of deployments, the payment of administrative fees and long resolution periods, the reduction of incentives to investment and maintenance of the infrastructure, and by limiting the provision of wholesale telecommunication services by operators. The IFT Board of Commissioners also concluded that the proposed corrective measures would result in an important increase in consumer surplus and fixed broadband penetrations in its municipalities. In this sense, by protecting the process of free entry and competition in the telecommunications and broadcasting sectors, the IFT is committed to the promotion of competition for the deployment of fiber and wireless infrastructure that incentivize the growth of expansion of 5G networks and the digital ecosystem. With respect to 5G, we have created a 5G committee as a mechanism in which the industry, academia, and any person can contribute to the adequate development and deployment of 5G in our country, particularly through the creation of working groups specialized in spectrum infrastructure and key 5G use cases, in which the participants will submit documents to discuss and analyze technical approaches and strategies for the effective implementation of 5G in Mexico. Well, as a sectoral regulator, we have a tendency to speak maybe too much about infrastructure, but finally, let me say something specific on the issue of digital markets, digital media. In Mexico has not ex-ante regulation or specialized ex-ante regulation on digital media or digital contents. So we will need a reform to define who is going to be responsible. There has been some attempts that have been discussed in Congress, and these attempts appear to be too preliminary because there has not been reached an agreement. So the only ones in which an agreement has been reached were those on imposing taxes on digital services. Those have already passed, but there are some proposals, for example, about the elimination of content or suspension or cancellation of accounts which have implications for freedom of speech and information. In these issues, the IFT has issued opinions on the specific initiatives that, for example, we have recommended more self-regulatory or quasi-regulatory approaches instead of this traditional, very in which judges are involved and the institute has to be involved in checking out what the people say and etc. We have more we have recommended more self-regulatory approaches. And I think I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and thank you for your insights and some of the work that you're doing. And I think interesting you mentioned infrastructure as well, because that obviously is something that constantly comes up when one's looking at the market power and also increasing competition. So thank you for injecting that into the discussion as well. That's much appreciated. So last but no means least, we have Dwayne Winsek. Dwayne is Professor in School of Journalism and Communication and Director of the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, and also involved in the Global Media and Internet Concentration Project. I hope I've got that right, at Carleton University. So Dwayne, over to you for your opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gordon, for having me. I'd also like to thank Lynn and Petra and Amanda and Melanie for putting all this together. And it's great to be here with my co-panelists. And I'm just sitting here on the edge of my seat listening to all this good stuff coming in from different parts of the world. So thanks a lot, everybody. So, you know, I tried to follow Gordon's questions here. I rearranged them a little bit. So here it goes. Do we need reform? Yes, absolutely. Is it underway? Absolutely. I've been working with Manuel Puppis, a professor at University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And what we've done is we've got an ongoing list of public inquiries, major regulatory cases, legislative proposals around the world. And that list is now over 100 entries long, with most of those occurring in just the last 2 to 3 years. So this issue is on fire. It is on fire around the world. The question is, you know, where do you kind of put yourself on these issues, and what are we going to do? Because something is being done. And I think it's a really good time to kind of be active and alive and, you know, engaged with these issues. The issues, I think, are more than just the digital platform regulation issues, although those are the ones that suck up all the oxygen. I think we're seeing some top to bottom reviews of communications and media policy taking place around the world for reasons that Tobias has just made clear. So I see a kind of a three-legged stool here: communications regulation reform, media policy reform, and a new generation of internet services regulation. I think we're also seeing some interesting points of convergence at the level of big cases, the legislative policy agenda, and conceptually across the Atlantic, at least. In terms of the big cases, we've got the EC's trilogy of Google cases, the German Federal Cartel Office's Facebook case that are being matched in the US now by the FTC's complaint against Facebook, the DOJ and State's Attorney General cases against Google for the reasons that Danielle pointed out. And we actually have an agreement just signed yesterday between EC competition authorities and the FTC. So we see people kind of joining forces, and I think this is a really good thing. There's a kind of a sharing of experience, of ideas and knowledge amongst regulators in an international circuit, if you will. Some of it working through the IIC, which I think the IIC should be commended for. So thank you. We also see this at the level of proposed legislation. We look at the suite of bills before Congress, and there's a lot in there that looks a lot like what we find in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act that are being proposed in the EU. And one of the things that I really like about both of those acts in the US, sets of acts in the US and in the EC, is that they are very, very targeted on what the EC calls VLOPs, very large online platform services, and in the US on the covered platforms. And how do you figure out which is which? Well, you look at their user base, you look at their revenues, and you look at their market cap. So this isn't a mystery, you know, and this kind of how something is going to be charged or not. You look at revenue, market cap, user base. There you go. Those are the thresholds. I like it. Where are we seeing things that we can kind of learn from and that look good, at least from where I stand? I kind of like the holistic and integrated approach that we're seeing in the European Union, based around what I would say is a half a dozen pillars. So we've got the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, and I like the nice and tidy division of those acts. On the one side, you got market and firm structure issues, and on the digital services side, you got questions of content moderation and online harms, and keep the two apart so they can be dealt with in each in their own unique ways. But underneath that is, you know, that's just the tip of an iceberg, because these things are integrated into a number of other things. A strong regulatory framework that deals with promoting competition in mobile, wireless, and internet access markets. Strong common carrier net neutrality rules, including a de facto ban on zero rating. EU-wide roaming and rights portability. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive for media and cultural services. And then, of course, the GDPR with strong data and privacy protection, all anchored in a human rights conception of privacy and data protection. So I like this very holistic, integrated approach, and I think a lot of people can learn from that. And I like the idea that it deals with both market issues as well as democratic values in a very explicit way. I think this is a real strength and a real virtue. We need to talk about these things. What about smaller countries? I think we can start to see now that we're seeing these cases move ahead, And I think it's best to see them as a mixed bag. Okay, so Australia, wow, look at a country kind of really punching above its weight. This is great. You got this trilogy of inquiries. You got the initial digital platform inquiry, you got the digital advertising inquiry that came out earlier this year, and you got the ongoing App Store investigation. This is great. It's dovetailed with and maybe even inspired some of the action taking place in the UK by the Competition Markets Authority, in the US around the Judiciary Committee's digital markets. I mean, everybody's bringing in the rock star, Rod Sims. I mean, he's got a rock star regulator. This is quite a phenomenon. All right, so I think this is quite good. It's actually led to legislation, the News Media Bargaining Code in Australia. It's inspired some of the legislation that you find in Canada, in the EU, and so on and so forth. All this is really good, okay? But, okay, and this is a big but, all right? We have to really understand that while this has crystallized an important and much needed public debate and a public policy agenda that for the first time puts the global internet giants' feet to the fire, we also have to realize that, look, there's a tainted origins problem here. All right, the digital platforms inquiries comes out of a backroom deal between the government and Australia's three major commercial entertainment media players: News Corp, Seven West Media, Fairfax Media 9. All right, the origins of these platforms lay in these companies' decision to bless the Liberal government's media ownership reform bill in 2016, a return from a government pledge to hold an inquiry into their biggest rivals, the vampire squids from Silicon Valley, as I like to kind of derisively pick up on the kind of sentiment in some quarters. And they've been really setting the agenda and running the show. And the government has been captured by this. And I don't think we should ignore this at all, because I think it undermines some of the really good things that we can do. And this is not just a thing that's of interest to Australia, because News Corp is a global media corporation, and it has, the Wall Street Journal in there and a big role to play in some of the major publishing and newspaper lobby groups. And I think what we're starting to see is self-interest commingle with a very much needed and criticism of the global internet giants and proper policy and regulatory formation. And now you start to get this kind of mixing of the two, and I think it's undermining the credibility and legitimacy of the discussion. What the Australian case teaches us, I think, is that the pursuit of internet regulation for the public interest and democracy must be ambitious in its goals, but it also has to be very circumspect about who has the power to define those rules. In Canada, we see something kind of similar going on. We just had the major broadcast telecommunications legislative review panel last year, and it's kind of the two solitudes report. In the first half, you've got some really intriguing stuff going on about CRTC reform, full stack neutrality provisions, from the internet infrastructure access up to platforms and devices. That's trading on some stuff that comes out of France and RCEP there, strong data and privacy protection stuff. But what's happening? All the oxygen is being sucked up around a very limited reform of Broadcasting Act reform, online harms, and make the web giants pay for news. Okay, and so we don't hear anything about the first half of the Butler report, and the public space is dominated by these other content related ones, and it's the same domestic kind of commercial interest, the counterparts to the Australians, that are really running the table on setting the policy agenda. And again, I want to make it crystal clear, I am full-throatedly in support of a very strong regulatory agenda that picks up on both market side issues and the democracy, pluralism, citizen issues that Tobias has got. But we have got to make sure that that is rescued from domestic interests who will wrap themselves in the flag and really, quite frankly, don't give a damn about democracy and these other issues, except for rhetorically. All right, so let's just move on here. What's going on from these cases that we learn? All right, I think we learned some really important things, is that the digital platform agenda is sucking up all the oxygen, and obscuring the issue of equally important issues around mobile wireless market, internet access stuff. I think one of the things that we really see coming out of the EU's trilogy of Google cases in the German Federal Cartels Office is that headline grabbing fines and conduct requirement or regulatory requirements and remedies have not resulted in the changes to the market outcomes and effective policing of powerful market actors that people have hoped for. I think we see the same thing in the United States. It's ditto for the FTC cases against Google and Facebook that go back to 2010. The companies just did not bend into line. The lack of results and the drawn out timeframes here, I mean, the Google shopping case has taken over a decade from launch to completion just a month or so ago. This is raising questions on whether monetary fines and conduct-based regulatory remedies are enough, if they're the right tools for the job. And increasingly, there's a conversation, a growing conversation around the reconsideration of the virtue of breakups, spin-offs, bright line rules, and stronger presumptions against future acquisitions, a ban on competition killing acquisitions. I think, the companies can thank themselves for helping to bring us here. They may have won their battle, but they didn't win the war by dragging the puck and dragging things out for a decade. So the problem is not unique to digital platforms. As I said earlier, in Canada, we're seeing conduct regulatory remedies in mobile wireless and internet access services have delivered some modest progress. Really important to underscore that modest progress. But for a quarter of a century, there's been incumbent intransigence, regulatory hesitance, even regulatory reversals, and policy indifference that has held back the promised benefits with respect to how greater reliance on market forces would serve public interest, the economy, society, and democracy well. I'll just end up with three final points here to kind of illustrate this. And with respect to the current CRTC, we see backpedaling on the regulated wholesale framework for mobile wireless services. We see backpedaling and in fact a about-face reversal with respect to the regulated wholesale framework for fiber-based internet access services. I mean, the incumbents have been appealing this framework that was put into place in 2015. They ran it down 6 tracks: appeals to cabinet, appeal back to the CRTC, appeal to the Federal Court of Appeals, appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, which actually called their case as being one of dubious merit. They didn't get anywhere, but what they did is they ragged the puck, they dragged up the timeline for 6 years, and this year, the CRTC, under its current chair, decided to do a complete do-over. It's opening the thing up again from scratch, which portends another 5 years. So basically, from the time the regulated wholesale access for fiber was put in place in 2015 to when it wraps up and we actually might see something on the ground, and God knows what it'll look like, that's 10 years. Okay, this is a really big blemish on the track record of conduct-based regulatory remedies. This is why we need structural remedies. And this is not a partisan thing. I mean, look, on Obama's watch, you had the FTC drop the ball on the Google and the Facebook cases. The conduct-based regulatory regimes that imposed on NBC or Comcast, NBC Universal turned out to be unworkable and very, very weak. All right. Although I would like to say too that as the Obama administration kind of grew into its role, it started to steal its spine, and you got a de facto kind of 4-3 ban on mobile wireless mergers. So the AT&T T-Mobile merger folded in 2011. The T-Mobile Sprint deal of 2014 that was on the table also folded when it looked like the regulators weren't going to move. And then finally we get the Trump administration approving T-Mobile Sprint deal with this really cockamamie scheme that the DOJ is going to act like a banker and help to assemble a fourth player to replace the one that's just been wiped out through this combination. And they try to bring Dish, this entity that has no experience whatsoever in mobile wireless services, cobble it together as an effective replacement for the now missing Sprint, and it's a joke. Okay, so we've had, depending on how you look at it, 10 years to 25 years of conduct-based regulatory remedies. They failed. It's time to shift the game. Okay. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm done. Thank you.
Dwayne, thank you so much. That was a whole kind of across the themes, and I think gives us a really, really nice intro. If I try to summarize very briefly across the panel, and then we'll go to the bigger themes. Firstly, I think we're getting a common message: reform is needed, and we are seeing a lot of initiatives, at present. I think what we've got to, and the reason that is largely due to the timeframes around existing interventions. There's the outputs that Danielle's described and the cases are being seen. There's the perceived failure of a range of antitrust cases, and I've been heavily involved in a number. And as Dwayne's pointed out, a decade-long case in a fast-moving digital market is a long time, and the markets move on dramatically. So I think we've just got, in the time we have left, to deal with 3 questions, very small questions. First question is who? So who do we regulate if reform is needed? Second one is why do we regulate? Is it an economic imperative, or as Tobias said, is it economic plus pluralism and others? So what are the key themes? And then the very small final one is how? Is it around data? Is it around merger intervention? Is it around separation? Yeah, again, I come from the telecom sector, where separation was the panacea for a long time, and I'm heavily involved in separation of entities to deal with these kinds of issues. Is that the right answer in these markets? So we've just got those very small themes to try and draw out. So we've got about 25 minutes left. So I think if we just maybe go to the first big theme, if I can open up to the panel for comments. We've talked about who will be targeted by any reform process. And in that context, we've been talking in the EU about gatekeepers. There's various definitions that have been thrown around about scale and size. Do anyone in the panel want to give their views on what those thresholds should look like to try and identify who should be the target? Or is it actually really simple, and if it smells like a problem, and it is a problem, or what are the thresholds that we should be looking at? Tobias.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating. 25 minutes and 3 questions. I think we should handle it. To come to your first question, who? Yes. First, I would like to add 1 point, just again, the perspective of a media regulator. I think the size of companies at the end is for a lot of topics relevant, but even for a lot of topics not. If you're a media regulator, you've got to say, violation of human dignity, hate speech, pornography in the area of children. These are all things that don't happen mainly on Facebook or YouTube. So we are mainly talking about small platforms. So my regulatory authority is fighting against pornography not against pornography, that's legal in Europe, but it's fighting against pornography without age verification systems. So this is also not mainly a problem of Facebook. So that's why I would like to underline that this idea that we just have got to take the size of a company and then we have it is, again, very logic from the competition perspective, but it's not the classical way for a media regulator, as you can believe too. So second, who? Yes, at the end, I think I always, because I'm just a media regulator, I try to make it simple. And at the end, responsible is who's setting the illegal action, and that are the persons or companies we've got to address. And that leads to the simple way, like always, first, of course, the content providers, then host, then access. And therefore, it's for me not interesting if, a company thinks it is access provider or content provider or host provider. It's just a question, what do we think? And this is something we've got to change. All these discussions with Facebook or Google, what they believe that they are, that's for me not interesting, as I said, I'm more simple structured. I would say if something walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and smells like a duck, it's a duck. And this would be the approach I have. And just to answer the other not asked questions about who, another who is who should set up the rules. And here I have really an important point from our side. We've got to bring again the society and the legislator in the driver's seat. At the end, it is more or less simple. We've got a society to say what we want. Then we've got to find a compromise. We call it normally law, set up by parliaments. And then we give it to the industry and they have got to follow it. And then we have regulators, they execute if they do not follow. If they do so, wonderful. So that's why I think, sometimes I have the feeling that that industry leads us in a kind of complexity trap discussion. And I've got to say, but I don't know if it's so complex. I know it's complex in detail, but in general, I would say, you know, this fantastic idea of democracy, setting up some rules, we call it law, it comes from parliaments, then we give it to the industry, everyone has got to respect it, and someone has, how to say, the sheriff star and takes care. That's the end of the story. And maybe we should try to follow this line a little bit also in the online world, knowing that at the end it's not that easy, but we could start with the more easiest way, and then we can say how complex it will get. Thanks.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And I think at the end, if we've got time, we should come back to that who question, because I think it is absolutely right. And we're seeing a massive divergence of approach in terms of who is setting the agenda here. And I like the question on industry. If industry wants a piece of regulation, it's very simple. If industry doesn't want a piece of regulation, it's very, very complicated, I think is the summary. So I think you're spot on. Maureen, I think you wanted to come in next.
Yes, thank you. So, you know, Gordon, you suggested there was a broader agreement in the panel than I think there really is. So I just want to make that clear. Now, I do agree with Tobias, his point about who is making this decision. I do think it should be the legislature. One of the things, this idea about having rock star regulators, and oh my gosh, isn't that great? You know, so for example, the FTC's role is to be an enforcer. And what is it enforcing? It is enforcing the laws that Congress enacts as interpreted by the courts, right? And so I think we lose sight of that when we start saying, oh, you know, they dropped the ball on this or that. They're not a legislature, they're not a regulator, they are an enforcer. And so the idea that they should bring cases that are not supported in the law, I think is problematic. I think when you're talking about who should be regulated, I think we need to take even a step back from that and say, for whose benefit, right? Whose interests are we concerned about? And I think that will help drive some of the regulation. So in antitrust law, it should be consumers. It shouldn't be other competitors' interests. It should be consumers. And I'm not so sure, you know, look, we've had enormous changes in the marketplace that have had, you know, really changed, you know, the landscape for a lot of players. And there may be other regulatory changes that would be beneficial there. As I may have mentioned, I'm a big supporter of the US enacting federal privacy law, because I think a lot of these changes, you know, or concerns really address you know, go to privacy issues. But I think we're losing sight a little bit of consumer interests here, because we talked about all these changes that have happened, but have we seen, you know, prices go up? Have we seen output go down? Have we seen choices be constrained? I think one of the things we've seen in the media space is, you know, look, I understand the advertising model, you know, has changed, and it's been difficult for some players, but the sources of information for consumers have really grown, right? And so we want to be really careful as we make changes that we pay attention to, you know, kind of to whose benefit this is accruing. And, you know, use the right regulatory tool to address that factor, and the right process, which is not, you know, for an enforcer under a very general antitrust statute to start trying to do everything and take into account all these competing values, because I think that creates a lot of difficulty. So I think those kind of fundamental issues are really, really key, and I think sometimes in the excitement they get lost a little bit. So I have my concerns about, you know, kind of saying, well, we want rock star regulators, we want to make these big splashy changes without underlying, you know, the fundamental for who, you know, under what regime, what powers have they been given, who gets to make those decisions, which kind of brings me back, I think, to Tobias's point about looking at, you know, the legislative process that weighs those different, you know, factors to come to a solution that, you know, where there's more general support.
Thank you, Maureen. I think that, no, that's absolutely right. And I think we are seeing that general trend to more legislative intervention, which is, as you say, in bringing in more stakeholders to that discussion, whether we get to the right answers, another one, and what I think you're right, that big question is what is the outcome? And I think you're right, consumer welfare, there's the wider sort of societal piece as well. But I know, given the fact Dwayne did raise the rock star regulator point, I should definitely let him come back here to comment back, and then we'll go to Danielle, who wants to come in as well. So Dwayne, if you want to just chip in here.
Sure, thanks. So I'll just a couple of points with respect to Tobias's points, and then Maureen, and then maybe something Danielle said earlier. So with respect to Tobias, absolutely. I mean, we need to bring society back in. I love the concept of the complexity trap. I think that's exactly what is invoked by basically making people's eyes glaze over and telling them to go home, that this is no place for them. In fact, what we ought to be doing is enrolling the public in these processes. And I will point to, 1966 in the United States, the United Church of Christ case. Up until that point, the FCC claimed to regulate in the public interest, but there was nobody there from the public to represent the public's interest. And so the United Church of Christ basically appealed the FCC decision dealing with Black communities and station ownership in Southern US. And the court said, hey, look, you got to let these people, the public, into the FCC proceedings so they can actually tell you what they are, as opposed to invoking this talisman. All right. So right on with that kind of stuff. The idea of rock star regulators, this is exactly the kind of problem that I am talking about when industry groups and their lobbyists have gained control of the regulatory agenda, especially when those lobby groups in the industry own the media that are most going after the vampire squids, right? So if you've got the most powerful media groups in each of the country and they find a regulator that's actually picked up their agenda, damn right it's going to be amplified and shouted from the rooftops of the nation and the world, all right? And so that is a problem. That's why we ought to get rid of the lobbynomics, as the old British professor Hargrave said about a decade ago, in relationship to this problem around copyright. And then the third thing I'd like to say here, and maybe if just indulge me for a second, I'm going to do a screen share here, is, and it's a response to something that Danielle said, because I share so much with what Danielle said about the problems with Google and Facebook's absolute dominance of the online advertising space, and not just their dominance, but their legal findings of abuse of dominance, and that this dominance is locked in now for a decade, and the vertically integrated walled garden ad stack, all of that stuff. I agree with you. But Danielle started out with a claim, and the claim is, I'm going to be really bold now, just so we have fun here within this thing, but the claim is wrong, all right? The claim was that the problems of the news media and newspapers coincides with the same period of time when we see the rise of Google and Facebook's dominance. Well, that's simply not true. I mean, take a look. Here's where newspaper circulation started to decline in Canada, 1970. Can everybody see that? Do you need more? Okay, let me just quickly go through a few. Now that's Canada. Maybe Canada is an anomaly. No. Look at the United States. It flatlines in 1966 and then starts to crash in the early 1990s. That's just one indicator. Let's look at revenue. Revenue basically kind of hovers around the same point in both the US and Canada, starting around 2005. And in 2008, it collapses. Why does it collapse? It collapsed because the global financial crisis kicks the legs out from underneath advertising spending in all the countries that it hits. We see the same thing in the United States. Look at it, basically kind of, it stays flat for the first half of the decade, and then it crashes in 2007. This is before Google and Facebook are dominant, okay? Let me just show the advertising stuff here. Advertising expenditures across the entire economy in all countries basically has stayed relatively flat over long periods of time, over stretches of decades. Look at what happens in Canada with the onset of the financial crisis. it crashes. So this means that as soon time that Google and Facebook are basically consolidating and locking in their dominance, the advertising market that buttresses the newspaper industry is crashing. It's falling. That's not just for Canada. This is for the United States. Okay. My last point on all this is we also have to keep this stuff in measure. Okay. Because as Maureen said, there is no crisis of the media. There's no generalized crisis of the media. There is a crisis of journalism. There is a crisis in some countries, okay, with advertising supported media, right? But most media now rely primarily on subscriber fees. That's the Canadian situation. There's the American situation. Last slide, okay? Who are the biggest companies in the United States? There we go. Google's number 4. Google's not swallowing the entire world, although it is a monster, and it does dominate, okay? And there, whoops, sorry. And there is Canada, okay? So, you know, we got to come together, okay? Because I think, you know, anyway, I've had my say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Danielle, you're going to want to come in here, I'm sure, both on the general comment and on those last slides. So over to you.
I don't have much to say on that because you would have to, and I've heard it all before. I've heard Craigslist was the actual cause for the demise. I've heard, I get that a lot. I get I mean, if we were to look at all the parts of history, obviously there's been inflection points at which the newspaper industry has been impacted, but it would be very difficult to ignore the mountain of evidence. And I'll put something in the chat here. I don't know if you can distribute it, that we have found of the direct nexus between the conduct of the platforms that I went over very briefly in my opening statement, but also that we have found through interviews, economic analysis, you know, directly what's happening with our newspaper visuals, everything that you see that you can find in what I've just shared with you, that identifies the direct nexus between the anti-competitive conduct and the harm that the news publishers are increasingly and continuously being impacted by. Despite record audiences, and oh, that's another one I get, that we don't have readers. So I've heard it all, but you would have to ignore a lot to embrace the idea that there's not a direct nexus. So the paper will do a good job of educating some. With regard to your question about who, I get asked a lot also, why just Google and Facebook? Apple News, other aggregators, other, you know, tech platforms have products, you know, Microsoft, so on and so forth. Microsoft actually licenses and pays for our content. But the others, you know, the reason why we're most focused on Google and Facebook is, like I said earlier, 70% of our distribution comes from those two companies. That is the majority of our referral traffic that comes from the two dominant companies that don't provide remuneration for that value that is also contributing to the revenue that they receive. They will say that news provides a societal benefit, but not any economic contribution to their revenue. And we obviously know that that can't be the case because news is under the search bar of Google and Google Discover. News is an entire vertical of their product. News is in their app. News is also, Microsoft will tell you that its MSN is the homepage of Bing for a reason. It's an attention grabber. It's engaging. There's time spent. There's substance. It's why its first party data is going to actually probably be beneficial as privacy moves to that for the news publishers. So to say that there's not an economic value for the content that's provided to the platforms that consumers engage in and provide their data, which is currency, is obviously a flawed argument. So after we introduced the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, I received that question a lot. Why does it only include Google and Facebook? And that's because they are our dominant referral traffic providers. The second thing that I would say is the who regulates. We believe that it does need to be a legislative initiative. Contrary to what was said earlier on the panel, in Australia, actually, large news publishers did get paid, but then you'd also have to ignore the fact that so did everyone else. Country Press News, 180 publications, regional and small press, came to a conclusion, and I can share that press release where there was an arrangement between Google. They were very pleased. I talked to the ACCC afterwards. They were very pleased with what they were paid. It was above estimated values, as well as the other regional and small publications. If you do not believe that legislation that requires payment by the dominant platforms is for big media, and that legislation only helps the large publications, all you have to do is look at history. The Facebook News tab paid 10 to 15 of the largest publications. It licensed content for the first time 2 years ago. Not our local and small publications were not included. They were not paid. So if left up to the marketplace rather than legislation, large publications are rewarded. They are picked off, so to speak. Legislation, and my 2,000 small and local member newspapers will tell you, is what's necessary to make sure everyone else gets paid. And that's why we're advocating for the JCPA. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Guys, we've got between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on we started early. So we've got scope for going through. One of the other questions that came out from all of our discussions, and we've touched on some of this, is what do the remedies look like? You know, so when one look, we've talked about the sort of the payment models, Danielle, around the media side, but in terms of some of the other gatekeeper-driven issues that we're having flagged, what kind of remedies do people think we should be looking at? And, you know, practically which ones will work? So, you know, we've had data, we've had data transfer, obligations. We're looking at things like interoperability, which is anathema to some, and some people see that as being the right answer. And then, as Dwayne raised, through to separation remedies, which we've seen in antitrust cases from the dawn of time, but now coming through. Do the panel have any views on what the right remedies look like, and what we should be thinking about now as we move forward and we see these reforms coming? Dwayne, go for it.
I will sit back. I just registered my hand. Just, I don't want to suck up all the oxygen here. So, I think, Danielle's right. I mean, we absolutely need legislation. And I think, the thing is, the News Media Bargaining Code, for example, in Australia, I mean, it does have a lot of promise, but I also think it's kind of a missed opportunity. So in terms of, the whole, the premise of it, that there is dominant market power, that dominant market power is inscrutable, and that inscrutable dominant market power is negatively affecting the news media. Those premises are fantastic, and they're on, okay? But now what the News Media Bargaining Code does is it basically sets up this corporatist bargaining arrangement, and it doesn't bring the public in, like Tobias suggested. There's no seat at the table for the public to get in here. It doesn't say, hey, let's have this new mandate where we have, we're going to have a open up the black box to discover what's inside, so everybody gets a look inside. It doesn't go after the extraordinarily weak privacy and data protection rules that have underpinned Facebook and Google's rise to the top, right? What it says is that to the domestic music companies, you too can get a slice of this ill-gotten gain. And you don't hear any of the domestic media companies saying anything about that, okay? And so I think this is, so we have to build on this really good kicking open the door. But now we really have to start thinking about legitimate policy and regulation within the context of democratic societies. And we're so far from that I'm worried.
Thank you, Dwayne. Tobias.
Thanks. I think that's a real excellent question. And, it's interesting to see. I don't know how the discussion is overseas, but in Europe, we have this discussion that also politicians are addressing us and saying, okay, but we really have got to do something because they are not respecting. They are so big and they are so dangerous and so on. So, and now let's just in between us, be very honest. What exactly should they respect? So, you know, it is up to us to define what we want. And yes, we can take, for example, the part of journalism, and we can say, yes, we as society would like to have that there is a kind of, how to say, privileged visibility of journalistic content. And if we do so, let's write it in the law, and then we can do so. You know, I think at the moment we've got to be a bit careful that we are, how to say, we are finger pointing someone who could be evil. I don't know, but they have, if they are, so I do not know. Maybe they are very, how to say, positive in their behavior in general, and I strongly believe that the most human beings and companies would like to behave on the correct way. But therefore, we've got to say what we want. And if you ask what the right remedies are, what I say, I can try to give an answer if you could ask me for what exactly. And this is, I think, something where we have got to be honest that that it's a little bit, how to say, we are again, it's again that we are running into a kind of felt complexity, that we have the feeling that this is so complicated and so on. And I'll say always to politicians, okay, please say what you want, and then we can do so. You know, it is a bit complicated, yes, and it's digital, yes, and it's global. But the problems behind it are the same: democracy, human dignity, protection of minors, securing pluralism, protecting consumers. You know, we have had a lot of changes in the last 20 years for sure. But as far as I'm informed, these principles haven't changed. So maybe we can take it, and then we can see what we do. And then, just as one example to be a bit more practical, I think, you know, the thing we can change a little bit is the question: is then the right toolkit self-regulation or regulation? And here I think the answer is, it is hybrid regulation. That means, of course, if we are talking about a worldwide market, then we can have a situation where we say, okay, if you're on a platform, then do whatever you want. You can write your terms and conditions, but we as society define red lines. And one red line is illegal content, and you've got to respect the situation in the different markets. It is as complicated as it is. You know, I come from Germany. It's also, how to say, if a German car building company wouldn't respect the rules in the US, I'm sure this would, in theory, have consequences. And it's the other way around. So if they would like to earn money, they are very welcome, but then respect the rules. So that's the one red line. And the other one, and here I come back to the journalism, the other red line can be that we say as society, okay, and dear platforms, you have got to transport and some topics or pieces of content, because we as society believe that this is important for democracy. So we can set up the rule. So if we just sit here and say, okay, but they don't doing anything, I've got to say, yeah, why should they? You know, the idea of companies earning money, that's very simple, and they are not, as far as I can see, mainly not behaving illegal. And that's why, coming back to your question, I would say, let's ask some legislators or parliamentarians if they would like to take their duty and sit down and write some rules. And then I'm sure that we will find a way to implement it.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I think that's right. Where do we turn? And I think particularly in a multi-jurisdictional world, where do we get that leadership from is going to be fascinating for the next 10 years. We've got only 5 minutes left, so maybe if I can ask any of the panelists, they've got final observations that they want to make based on the comments to date, and we can then wrap up at that point. Nivea, I see you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Okay, so I was trying not to, you know, get out of my existing crease, which is the CCC crease. But I'm going to just step a little bit into my previous hat, which really deals with regulation for communications and media. And I just want to say one thing, because we have a lot of principles being discussed in the global sphere. And there are a lot of words being bandied about democracy and protection of rights. But at the end of the day, it's really something about control. It is about who controls the voice, who is controlling the information that we receive. And the more you look at it, you realize that yes, rules have a place and quality standards have a place. But there's actually no element that is really and truly governing or assisting the recipient of all this information, who is in control of what we think, what we believe, and why we believe what we believe. And I think that is the major concern that I have right now in this day and age with how we do media regulation, content regulation, and publications as a whole. Because I think, you know, we have so much information being created and there's no quality attached to it. Sometimes when somebody writes me something and I get an opinion and it's from a blog or it's from some other open-ended source, I say, okay, did you verify the information in this before you're asking me to take a decision on it? And it's the same thing in our homes and with our children. They are being confronted with different opinions, different things, and they are being streamlined. So I think, you know, at the back of our heads when we write policies and legislation right now, let's look at who is controlling what and really look and fine tune where does this line exist between what I would call cyber grooming and cyberbullying and free speech. Because we heard a lot about cyberbullying and cyber grooming and being groomed to accept certain things about a decade ago. And now it's all about being very free flow and being very free opinion and so on. And therefore you have harms, not just competitive harms, but social harms, economic harms. But I'm really looking at the social harm right now because we've brought the discussion into a media realm. Let's just keep those things in the back of our heads, especially for those who are 18 and under, because sometimes we treat 18 and under or 3 and over as if they are 21 and over or 50 and over, and they're not. And the most vulnerable in society are the ones being most exposed and most hurt by the policies and legislation that we are passing right now. So that's just my little 2 cents, and thank you very much for your excellent chairmanship, Mr. Moore, and I appreciate all the panelists and their opinions. It's been really a good session for me, and I hope those who tuned in, it was also helpful to them, and thank you for IIC as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, unless any other comments, that's a wonderful place to stop. I think with that societal wider piece, we've talked about the economic regulation, but I think that's a really nice place to stop. So thank you all the panelists. Thank you to the IIC for setting us up and for pulling us through. The panelists, great insights and great input. So thank you all so much. Back over to you, Lynn, I think.
Thank you, Gordon. An excellent session with a range of views to manage in a relatively short space of time. So thank you to you all. Okay, so as I bring day one to a close, I would like to thank all of our speakers and moderators for an excellent start to the IIC's annual Washington DC TMF, albeit virtually. Our thanks also go to Amazon for kindly sponsoring the TMF and supporting the IIC. We return tomorrow for day 2 at 8:10 ET and open with a conversation on national and international policy objectives between Evelyn Remillet of NTIA and Peter Fattelnig from the EU's delegation to the USA. We will then move on to our panels who will focus on broadband and 5G supply and demand, finishing with a discussion on privacy and cybersecurity. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.